Hi, this is Ted Habermann from Metadata Game Changers. I want to talk to you today about responding to the Nelson Memo, or more importantly, repository recuration for open science. Recreation is sort of a new word and or a new concept, so I wanted to make it easy to remember with an easy example. So this is where we start. All data sharing projects, we have data. And this is 2 data sets that we can see here, and there's no metadata for either one of these data sets. When we put the data sets into a repository, in a lot of repositories, they have minimum metadata requirements, and those minimum metadata requirements are, usually names, titles, maybe a publication date, maybe a link if you're lucky. But so this is really generally discovery metadata, and it's the minimum requirements in many repositories. That metadata helps us discover things, might help us discover things, but it's difficult then to understand them or understand whether they're really the data we want. There is a curation process, usually getting that metadata and the data sets into a repository. And recuration process is curating again. In this case, adding identifiers and other metadata that make the data more fair, and importantly in this thought, connect it to other data sets or connect it to other people, organizations, other objects in the research landscape. So to put it in the context of get away from groceries and talk about metadata, our starting point is current metadata, and this is current metadata usually in a repository, and it's many times minimal metadata, consistent with the minimum requirements that we talked about. So the recuration process is adding new content to that metadata somehow, and then importantly, with the goal of sharing it in the global research infrastructure. So the global research infrastructure is something that I talk a lot about, and it's really when I talk about it, it's really the big players in identifier infrastructure. Really, DataCite is mostly started out as a repository of data sets. Now it's really a repository of data sets and many other kinds, up to 28 different kinds of research objects. Crossref is a repository primarily of published journal articles and books and book chapters. ORCID, the green ID, is an identifier for people and researchers. And then ROR, the Research Organization Registry, is identifiers for organizations. So recuration, the definition, is adding new content to repository metadata to improve connectivity, fairness, and compliance with the Nelson Memo. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk about this in terms of 3 eagers, and eagers are a certain type of NSF proposal. There are 3 of them I'm going to talk about. The first is Dryad Bridge, building repository interconnections with Dryad guidance and extensions. The second is completing the life cycle, developing evidence-based models of research data sharing, it's called RADS for short. And finally, the Fair Island project for place-based open science. And EAGR stands for Early Concept Grants for Exploratory Research. So there's sort of the idea of exploratory things. And these are 3 EAGRs that I've been working on. They're all 3 in their second year. And what's interesting about them is they represent 3 different sort of elements in the repository landscape. The first one is focused on Dryad in general. It's a generalist repository, a large generalist repository, been in existence since 2008 or so, has roughly 40,000 research objects, data sets primarily in it from various domains. RADS is about institutional repositories at research institutions, universities mostly, research universities. These are also multi-domain and focused on communities in the university. And finally, Fair Island is based on, or is about field stations, biological field stations in this case, which it turns out are very similar to facilities, research facilities in multiple domains. But what we're working on, it turns out, all three of these eagers, and parts of those eagers, is adding identifiers to the metadata that's in these repositories, and then migrating that metadata to the global research infrastructure and making connections with people, funders, organizations, other papers, publications, software, etc. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. We'll start out with Dryad, a generalist repository. And I mentioned Dryad started in 2008 with very simple metadata. In fact, the depositing data to Dryad page said to deposit data, simply mail it to submit@datadryad.org. Please include, this is the metadata requirements, please include a title and a short description for each file, as well as a reference to the relevant publication. So as I mentioned, this is a situation in which a repository has very simple metadata requirements, but one of the important ones is this reference to the relevant publication, because this provides for the data set that you're submitting into Dryad a connection to the global research infrastructure that can be used as a source for recuration of the metadata. That's what I'll be talking about. So even in 2008, at the very beginning of Dryad, this idea of a connected infrastructure, connecting data sets and papers, was starting to develop. So the initial recuration in Dryad was focused on research organizations and RORs. So we started with Dryad. I mentioned there were connections in Dryad to the global research infrastructure, in this case to Crossref papers, journal articles in Crossref. We retrieved from those journal articles the affiliations of the authors, because remember, the simple Dryad metadata model did not have affiliations. So we got the affiliations from Crossref, and then we used those affiliations in the early days of ROR to try to find identifiers associated with those affiliations called RORs. And we brought those RORs back into the Dryad metadata. So now we had 4 authors in Dryad. We had affiliations and RORs, and Dryad was using DataCite as their backend repository, which is a great idea. It's in the research infrastructure, and we were able to share the affiliations and the RORs with DataCite. So now the graph of these things, the connected picture of of 3 things, included organizations along with data sets and publications. Of course, Crossref metadata in some cases also includes funder information and award numbers. So we were able to retrieve the funder names and award numbers from Crossref, and then add those to the metadata that was inserted into DataCite. And this was the ROR part of this was done prior to the eager, the Dryad Bridge eager. The funding information was added as part of that eager, and now the picture of the connected picture of the research infrastructure was expanding to include funders. An important part of this is making the invisible visible. Metadata identifiers and other elements of the metadata are in the metadata records, but they're hard to see. So how do we make these connections visible? Right now, we do that using DataCite Commons, which is a user interface for searching what's called the PID graph, the permanent identifier graph, which is being worked on by all of the partners in global research infrastructure that I mentioned, and allows you to search for connections to works, which are research objects, papers, data sets, etc., people, organizations, or repositories. So in this case, I'm searching for the University of Colorado in Boulder, where I live. And up comes this page that has a number of works that are whose authors have affiliations of the University of Colorado or Boulder. And the interesting thing is that they're from Dryad. So it turns out that when we did this work a couple years ago, I used the DataSite Commons. Many of the data sets that came up, in fact, you would scroll through data set after data set were from Dryad, and they reflected the fact that in this case, the ROR for the University of Colorado Boulder was inserted into the metadata at Dryad, which then went to DataSite and became part of the DataSite Commons. I mentioned that we also added funder information to as many of these data sets as we could find it for. So this is a search in the DataSite Commons for the National Science Foundation, and brings up works, in this case 1,142 works that have the ROR for the National Science Foundation as the funder identifier. And again, you see these, many of these data sets are in the Dryad repository. So the important part about this is that Dryad added connections to the global research infrastructure for thousands of organizations and funders. And this is an important part of supporting the global research infrastructure. It's possible for repositories, particularly general repositories like Dryad, or even institutional repositories where researchers work across many organizations and also field stations, which is in the same place. When those organizations improve their metadata with connections to organizations and funders, they help thousands of people, or some number of people. In the Dryad case, it was thousands, by connecting those people's organizations, and in some cases, with ORCIDs, those people and their funders into the big picture. RADS, I mentioned, is institutional repositories. So repositories, multi-domain repositories at multiple universities. And these repositories serve researchers. And in fact, the librarians and data managers at the institutional repositories do an amazing job of working with those researchers to help them understand metadata requirements and provide high quality, rich metadata for data sets that go into the institutional repositories. Another thing that those data managers do is they help people understand the importance of identifiers. And for data sets, many of them provide minimal metadata to DataSite in order to get a DOI, or a digital object identifier, for the data set that's in the institutional repository. So the use case in this case for DataSite is provide a DOI for a data set. Generally, a data set could be also text, objects, or many other kinds of things. But give me a DOI for that, please. And in order to get that, I'll give you minimal metadata. What we were interested in this case, was re-curating the DataSite metadata by adding the rich metadata that was available, already existing in the institutional repository, adding that into DataSite, recurating the DataSite metadata, as I mentioned, to improve its breadth or its depth. So this is really improving the fairness of the data, of the metadata in DataSite and in, therefore, the global research infrastructure. It's important that we work to improve that metadata so that it is the data sets, the actual global research infrastructure becomes more fair. Finally, facilities, field stations as facilities. There are many biological, in this case, biological field stations and facilities all over the world. and they all have a need to receive acknowledgement for their many contributions. So they contribute logistics, they contribute accommodations, places to stay while research is happening. They contribute labs and lab space and instruments. A wide variety of contributions are made by these field stations and facilities to research that goes on. They also need to identify data sets that are created by users at the facilities, and they need to share those data sets more effectively. If you look around at these field stations, it turns out that many of their information systems are internally focused, so they're not connected to the broader research community. And there are a variety of reasons for this, many related to funding and support for information system development and maintenance and migration. It's just a difficult thing as many of you know, a difficult thing in many cases to keep up. So the question that we asked is, could we add identifiers and make connections that address these needs that I mentioned here above? So the recuration that we did there had to do with PIDs, once again, permanent identifiers. And we started by giving roars to the field stations as research organizations. In this case, for a field station on an atoll called Tetiaroa, we worked with ROAR to get an identifier for that field station. And then we created DOIs for projects that that had been done, and some that were proposed for the future at Tetiaroa. And these DOIs were registered through, in this case, EasyID, into DataSite. So these are DataSite identifiers in the global research infrastructure. And in that metadata, we included the ROARs for the field stations as contributors, actually as sponsors for that project. In the DataSite vocabulary, sponsors are in-kind contributors to projects. So it was a perfect fit for these research stations that are making generally in-kind contributions to the research projects. So now the global infrastructure for these situations for organizations added field stations and facilities already to the DataSite metadata that includes publications, connections to papers, funders, and people. So the field station connections look like this in a simple graph with the Tetiaroa field station with the ROAR that we got for the field station, connected using DOIs to the research plans. In this case, just 3. Our pilot included over 1,000 of these projects, and then those projects with the high quality or the identifier-rich DataSite metadata that we created for them had connections with researchers, institutions, data sets, and funders. So starting to build that knowledge graph around field stations that includes research organizations and people, and actually much more. So what more? Remember, these eagers are experimental projects, so we're experimenting with some ideas, and one idea that we're experimenting with is using DataSite metadata for projects. Many people in many different domains around the world in many different settings have discussed project metadata and used many metadata standards for projects, and exploring DataSite seems like a natural thing to do. Many of these field stations have used Zotero as a bibliography for papers that are written, and it could be other things that are related to the research done at the field station. So we use those Zotero bibliographies to retrieve DOIs, ORCIDs, ROARs, and funder information when we can. We're also using XTD, which started life as GeoDeep Dive, an EarthCube project at NSF, And it differs from Zotero in that it's full text search with very powerful and interesting, sort of newish, not that new, but sort of newish capability. And searches for, in this case, searching for names of the field stations. These names tend to show up in acknowledgements or within the text of papers, just like names of data sets. So this gives you another way for retrieving DOIs and ORCIDs, RORs and funders, and adding those in, connecting those in through related identifiers into the data site metadata. Many of these projects at field stations involve collecting samples. This is a map of samples collected on Teddy Aroa for a particular project. And the International Generic Sample Number, IGSN, is in the process of pretty far along, actually, in the process of merging with DataCite and using DataCite DOIs as identifiers for samples. Geome is an electronic field notebook used in many field station related projects. So we were able to extract samples from Geome and give them identifiers, DOIs, and connect them into the DataCite project. In this case, actually, the identifiers are ARCs rather than DOIs, but that's fine. Finally, data management plans. In this case, from the DMP tool at the California Digital Library, a tool for creating data management plans that are consistent with requirements of various funders. Many of these projects and field stations have multiple funders, and they have multiple grants and multiple data sets, and the data that they collect can evolve over time. So it's very possible for a single project to end up with multiple data management plans. And all of those can be connected because data management research output plans is one of the types for DataCite. So in addition, in the last slide, we showed identifiers for organizations and people, funders, et cetera, in DataCite. These are some of the sort of new kinds of things that we're using to try and search, once again, the global research infrastructure and different pieces of it for various items that we can connect and make the DataCite metadata as complete or as rich as possible. So whenever we're working to improve something, whatever it can be, it's important to try and measure it. And so for this connectivity, I use a simple graphic in some collection of DOIs, of research objects or various things that we're measuring metadata for. Those things can have complete identifiers. So identifiers say ORCIDs for all authors. They can have partial identifiers, ORCIDs say for some authors, or RORs for some organizations. Or unfortunately, in some cases, they could be missing, having no identifiers. And as we work on these, recreating these collections through time, obviously our goal is to add identifiers and for the green bar to get larger and the red bar to get smaller. So in this case, with the Gump field station, which is in French Polynesia, I mentioned there many field station data sets or data systems are sort of focused internally. So in the baseline, the original case, Gump had no RORs or identifiers for no organizations we knew names for the organizations but no identifiers. We were able to search for RORs in various ways. Starting, I said, no RORs, adding RORs for known organizations, and then searching for other RORs in various places. And we went from no RORs in the data up to complete RORs for 84% of the activities in Gump. We're still left with 4% with no RORs. Usually, the most common situation is it's an organization that doesn't yet have a ROR. So we're working to help them get RORs and fill in that 4%. Orchids are more difficult than roars for various reasons. Human names are much more diverse, for instance, than organizational names. In this case, we started with 13 orchids in the data set. We mentioned searching public, that's the XDD. It's a USGS interface for searching XDD. The first phase, we found some roars and increased the complete a little bit and the partial a little bit. And then finally, we looked in LTER articles that were there's an LTER, long-term ecological research station at Gump with a Zotero bibliography. So we searched that bibliography for orchids. We went from 4% complete and 78% missing up to 16% complete and 50% missing. So we still have work to do, but I think it's great to improve the number of complete, number of activities with complete orchids by a factor of 4, and get into the 50% range for things that just that are still missing orchids. Ongoing work to try and fill that in. So we've had a recuration tale of connections. In the first case, the Dryad Bridge eager generalist repository, we really had two-way identifier flow going here. We went from DOIs that were in Dryad into Crossref in the global research infrastructure, brought back affiliations, took those affiliations, went back into ROAR, and then added the affiliations and the ROARs into the global research infrastructure. Then did the same thing with funder information. Once again, getting everything actually into both repositories. In the eager case, was flow from the rich metadata in the institutional repositories into DataSite, into the global research infrastructure, pretty much a one-way flow at this point, increasing the fairness of the metadata in DataSite for these data sets in the institutional repositories. And finally, adding new identifiers and relations between things to new DataSite metadata for projects and related things at Fair Island, the field station at Fair Island. So in this case, again, sort of connecting for the first time these data and information systems from the field stations and potentially from facilities into the global research infrastructure. So I hope that you all agree that all three of these projects have increased fairness and also increased compliance with the Nelson memo. So just to review that, the Nelson memo said we recommended we collect and make publicly available appropriate metadata associated with publications and data resulting from federally funded research. The metadata should include names and identifiers for authors and sources of funding and organizations as appropriate, dates of publication that we didn't talk about today, and unique digital persistent identifiers for the research output. We did this in all three cases, and once again, to remind you, recuration is adding new content to repository metadata to improve connectivity, fairness, and compliance with the Nelson memo. Thank you very much. If you have questions, you can send me an email, ted@metadatagamechangers.com. There are links here to titles, at least, and the slides are available. Links to blogs on the Metadata Game Changers website that provide more details and some other examples, actually, of recuration. So thank you very much. I hope that you enjoyed this talk. And I'm excited to keep moving this work forward. Thanks very much.